All right, welcome to our 57th SLiTHER. This is our first SLiTHER of the 2024 year. I'm Kyle Grice, and I'm going to be hosting today. And our presenter, and who will help engage and lead our discussion today, is Dr. George Stanley. Professor Stanley got his bachelor's from the University of Rochester with Rich Eisenberg and a PhD with Al Cotton at Texas A&M. And he started his career at WashU in St. Louis, and then moved to LSU as well, and worked many years there. And is now an emeritus professor, and he's currently enjoying life in Colorado. But today he has a really interesting story to tell us that we're going to talk about, thinking about what happens and what to do when some of your research results get questioned. So with that, I think Shirley, do you have a little anecdote about how this came to be? And then we'll pass it off to George.
Yes. So this idea came about to have a SLiTHER on this topic because George and I and Joanne Stewart ran into each other at the expo at the ACS meeting in San Francisco in August, and it only took us almost 6 months to make it happen. So we're doing well, right, on the timescale of academics here. But it was just intriguing to hear that here's an example of a professional disagreement and a chance to talk about how to handle it. So I'm really looking forward to it, George.
Right. All right. Thank you. And George, you can take it away.
Okay. Well, it's great to be talking to you about this. It's the first time this has happened to me. So what do you do when your published results are questioned? Okay. And it concerns the research of Drew Hood and Ryan Johnson. This is at their graduation at LSU. So let's get into it. So my research involves hydroformylation. I'm not going to talk too much on it, but just hydroformylation is a big industrial process, 15 million metric tons per year by industry, taking carbon-carbon double bonds plus carbon monoxide and hydrogen to make aldehydes. And you can make either linear or branched aldehydes, depending on whether you insert the formyl group at the terminal carbon or the internal carbon. And the two possible side reactions, common side reactions, would be olefin isomerization, which is very bad if you're starting with a one alkene, because those are more expensive. But if you're starting with an internal alkene, then isomerization might be very good, and that certain hydroformylation catalysts certainly rely on that. The one thing you don't want is alkene hydrogenation, because once you hydrogenate the double bond, you have an alkane, and that really is sort of, it's not worthless, okay, but it's not anywhere near as useful, okay. Industry generally wants the linear aldehyde for a variety of reasons. The branched aldehydes, the star indicates a chiral center, are potentially interesting for pharmaceutical applications. But to my knowledge, no pharmaceutical company is doing asymmetric hydroformylation. Okay. Shown below here are the four major industrial processes. We have the high pressure hydridyl cobalt tetracarbonyl process. This was the original process discovered by Otto Roland back in 1938 by accident. It is currently used by several companies. Probably the largest would be ExxonMobil. Okay. There's also the high pressure rhodium, hydridyl rhodium tetracarbonyl process. Both of these processes, these catalysts are extremely active. The rhodium catalyst is the most active hydroformylation catalyst known. The problem with both of these is they need fairly high pressures to stabilize these carbonyl species. The rhodium loves to clusterify, turn into clusters, which are not active for hydroformylation. And the cobalt system decomposes the cobalt metal, which isn't very good either. In the early 60s, Shell Chemical discovered the phosphine modified cobalt technology. By adding a phosphine, you stabilize the pi back bonding and you make it much less susceptible to decomposition reactions, which allows you to run under milder pressures. And that's pretty important for industry because high pressure processes, building a high pressure plant costs a lot of money. Okay, so they much prefer medium to low pressure technologies if possible. The problem with this, the other nice thing about this technology is It does olefin isomerization, and Shell uses internal alkenes. So it's very important to isomerize the double bond from an internal position to an external position and get pretty good linear branch selectivity, because they are making detergents and surfactants where the linearity is pretty important. The problem, of course, is phosphines dramatically slow down the catalyst system. They stabilize it, but they also slow it down. And if the phosphine dissociates, you get decomposition. So there is still a decomposition problem with this system. And then, of course, the system most of you are familiar with, okay, is the low pressure phosphine or phosphite modified rhodium technology. And this is used in about 75% of hydroformylation plants. But the other 25% uses these high and medium pressure technologies. So there's a problem with each of these, okay, even though they're used commercially. So we were studying a radically new type of catalyst system that we published back in 2020. And this is a highly active cationic cobalt-2 hydroformylation catalyst. And this was in collaboration with ExxonMobil. Alex Carpenter was a synthetic chemist from ExxonMobil that we worked with. And Jared Juncker was the DFT expert at ExxonMobil, who did a boatload of calculations on our system. I do calculations as well, but Jared is a real expert. Okay. So we published this paper. I'm not going to go into the catalysis details, okay, although I have some extra slides if anyone's interested. And we started with these cationic precursors, both in the cobalt-2 oxidation state with these ACAC and these super chelating bisphosphine ligands. Okay, and there's a long story that I'm not going to tell on why we settled on these systems. But one reason is our dicationic dirhodium hydroformylation catalyst. We realized pretty early on the important role of a localized cationic charge on the metal center, which enables a lot more lability of the carbonyl ligands and allows the alkene and the hydrogen to get in. So that's one reason we looked at these cationic cobalt systems, which surprisingly no one else had really looked at. Okay. And we do not add any excess phosphine ligand with this system, which is very different because almost all other hydroformylation catalysts need some excess phosphine ligand. They all have some dissociative equilibrium. Okay. So we published this, and I'll just quickly show you what the active catalyst is. The previous slide had the catalyst precursors. So the active catalysts are these bisphosphine cobalt hydridocarbonyl complexes, all cationic. And you also look, I've shown the electron counting. These are all radical odd electron systems, okay, which is also very unusual. Almost all the other hydroformylation catalysts known are even electron dimagnetic type systems, okay. And the fact that it's a radical system gave us a lot of problems because it limited our use of NMR for characterization, okay. So a couple, it's basically a standard hydroformylation cycle with two exceptions. One is that we think this ability to form a 19 electron species is very important because what it does is it labelizes this equatorial carbonyl and allows the alkene to coordinate. The axial carbonyls are more labile, but the axial coordination site is sterically hindered, and we can do very sterically hindered alkenes with this catalyst. And the DFT calculations and our intuition is that it has to come in on this equatorial position. But that's the strongest binding carbonyl. So by forming a 19 electron system, we help weaken this equatorial bond as well as the axial bonds. And the strong chelating phosphine does not want to fall off. Okay. So, and then the other interesting step is we don't propose an oxidative addition of hydrogen. We propose this heterolytic cleavage of dihydrogen to eliminate the final aldehyde. And almost every other hydroformylation catalyst relies on oxidative addition. But of course, oxidatively adding to a cationic cobalt in the +2 oxidation state is a very unlikely situation. So we favor, in computational work that we and other authors have done, also support this heterolytic cleavage, which is very different in hydroformylation. So we stay within the +2 oxidation state for this entire catalysis. Now, after we published this in 2020, in 2022, Professor Zhang and Dr. Franke and their grad student, Christoph Kubis, published this paper also in Science, where here's the abstract where they say that our recently reported bisphosphine coordinated cobalt-2 catalyst, which we could not reproduce, okay? So basically said that our catalyst system didn't work. And they also implied, although they didn't come out in the paper and directly say it, they felt that the old hydridyl cobalt tetracarbonyl catalyst system was probably what we were observing in our catalyst, and it wasn't this cationic cobalt-2 bisphosphine complex. Okay, so Dr. Robert Franke, I never met him, but he is a hydroformylation expert. Oops. Sorry, I got a phone call. I have to stop my phone. Okay, there we go. Good. It's just spam. Okay. So Dr. Franke is a hydroformylation expert who works at IONiC, and he's extremely well known in the hydroformylation field. In fact, he received the Otto Roland Medal, which is for hydroformylation expertise. He is an expert at rhodium hydroformylation, and the first reference in our science paper is to his review on hydroformylation paper, on hydroformylation catalysis systems. Almost all, it's mostly on rhodium technology, okay, which he is an expert on. And Dr. Zhang was his collaborator who was at the Leibniz Institute for Catalysis, okay. I'm mainly just going to mention them, the two of their names and not the grad student, because I believe they're mostly responsible for calling us out on this, okay. So I was rather disturbed at this, a world famous hydroformylation expert saying that our catalyst doesn't work, okay. So, and here's a couple quotes from their science paper, okay. Basically what it says is that they found that our catalyst didn't work. I don't need to read these. And they also sort of imply that throughout the paper that it's just really the hydridyl cobalt tetracarbonyl catalyst system, which they studied under milder conditions and found that it was similar to the conditions we were running at. And they sort of intimate that that was the true catalyst system, okay, for our system. So now, the first thing when someone says that your research is wrong, okay, or your catalyst doesn't work or something, is you go back and did we make a mistake? Okay. So first off, Drew Hood was this fantastic grad student who discovered this catalyst system, okay, and he did a lot of fantastic work on it. I had a second grad student, Ryan Johnson. These are my last two PhD students. And they both independently made and tested the catalyst system. And they did many hundreds of runs. Ryan was actually working on our dirhodium catalyst system, and we switched him over to the cobalt system because it was a real breakthrough and super exciting. Okay, so and then our collaborator at ExxonMobil, who we contacted, and he was assigned to work with us, was Dr. Alex Carpenter. He's an independent expert at polymerization and hydroformylation catalysis, and he's also an expert on cobalt chemistry. And so he also, not only did we send him samples that he tested and ran, okay, but ExxonMobil also sent us mixes of their alkene system that they run in their hydroformylation plant, one of which is in Baton Rouge. And we showed them our results, and they were very impressed with those, okay? And we were running under conditions where hydridyl cobalt tetracarbonyl was very unlikely to be the true catalyst system, okay, even at that early stage. But one of the things Alex told us early on was that cobalt chemistry can be very tricky, okay? And we certainly found that out because I wanted Drew to make a different catalyst than the precursor than we actually used, but he found that it was really hard coming up with a rhodium-1 cationic species. So he shifted over to using a rhodium +2 oxidation state cationic complex, and that was very important for this whole project, okay? So all three of these had independently made our catalyst system and done many, many runs, okay? And particularly Alex, who independently made the catalyst at ExxonMobil and tested it there, okay? So I felt pretty sure that we were not the ones that were making the mistake, but that's always the first place you look is, did you goof up? Did we make some mistake? Okay. Now, when I retired, Professor Matt Chambers, we'd hired him a couple years before I retired, and he's a wonderful person in doing catalytic chemistry at LSU. He inherited all my hydroformylation equipment in my research labs, our GC mass spec, high pressure IR cells, everything, okay? And he decided, took him a little while, but he decided that this was a significant enough discovery. He wanted to continue studying it because he had all the perfect equipment to do so. So he has continued to study our catalyst system, and he's had two of his grad students make the precursors many, many times and do independent runs. And he's even had an undergraduate, Trey, also make catalyst precursor and do hydroformylation runs, all completely independently from us, okay? So now they did find that making the precursor can be a little tricky, but they're working on ways of making it very consistently. And we didn't really have any problems, nor did Alex have problems at ExxonMobil in making the catalyst precursor. Of course, Alex is a cobalt expert. Now, what Alex did find is in trying to recrystallize our catalyst precursor, he often got ligand exchange reactions that were not good. So we usually powdered out our catalyst precursor and ran with that as sort of a non-crystalline powdery material. But generally, we think the purity is well above 95% for our catalyst precursor. So now, after Frank's paper came out in Science, we were actually contacted completely independently by Professor Wen from China, who was studying our catalyst system independently, okay? And he reported that he was seeing, they had a little bit of problem making the catalyst precursor, but he also made it, and he's been studying it for a couple of years now, and he sees very similar results to what we see, including the fact that electron donating phosphine ligands actually make a better catalyst system, okay? He was running under milder conditions, so he actually saw an induction period. He hasn't published his stuff. I can't tell you anything about it in detail, but it backs up everything that we saw with our system, okay? So, and then finally, I want to say how important it is to have independent verification when you have a really unusual result, okay? And this is our first science paper on our dirodium catalyst way back in 1993. And we had the catalyst independently tested by Union Carbide, okay, and Herc Celanese, and they both confirmed that this dirodium catalyst system was what we claimed, because at that point it was a very unusual observation. So I think when you get something really unusual that's maybe too good to be true, it's really good to be very careful in your testing. Have separate grad students test it from start to scratch, even send samples off and have it independently checked by people that you trust and aren't going to steal your results. Okay. So at this point, we were pretty sure we started looking more carefully, since we thought we were correct. We started looking more carefully at Frank and Zhang's work and seeing that they probably made the mistake at their end. And indeed, that's indeed what happened. And this is our first letter that we wrote to Dr. Frank, Dr. Zhang, and the editors of Science, okay? We included the editors of Science on all our communications with Frank and Zhang on this, okay? So we didn't have really too many problems with their claims that the hydrido-cobalt tetracarbonyl catalyst system could operate under milder conditions than most people think, because we were working with ExxonMobil, who's an expert on this type of catalyst system. But the real problem was in making our catalyst precursor. And that's where they goofed up, okay? So we included lots of information. So here's the prep of the catalyst precursor. We start with the cobalt bis ACAC complex, hit it with HBF4 to kick off one of the ACACs, okay, and that's a somewhat tricky step. And we make the dioxane solvated complex. And then we react it with the chelating bisphosphine, and we form the BF4 catalyst precursor salt, okay? And we've only studied the BF4, but any non-coordinating anion should work fine here. You don't want to use any halides because they can potentially bind to the metal center. So we did have some issues with this because different batches of HBF4 etherate that we got in often work differently, okay? And we actually, this is a note that's in the actual synthesis for the supplementary material that, yeah, this can be a little bit tricky, so be careful, okay? So now here is our part of our infrared spectrum. We published, of course, the full solid state infrared spectrum of the catalyst precursor. And in blue is Frank and Zhang's, what they published in their supplemental material as a solution. Now that's a little weird, publishing a solution spec part, and they had a solvent present, okay? But you can see just that what limited information they published did not match what we published, okay? So, and then if you look at the proton NMR, here is our proton NMR, okay, of this catalyst precursors, the phenylated superchelating phosphine, and here is theirs, okay, and they're very different. Okay, right away you can see we have a broad peak at -6 and another broad peak at 32. This is a paramagnetic complex, okay, and they don't have that at all, okay. And if you look at the rest of the spectrum, it doesn't really match up well at all, okay. And then they also reported a P31 spectrum where they saw some broad bands at 54 and 73 ppm. And another impurity peak at 12 ppm, but we didn't see any P31 NMR at all, which is typical what you expect for a phosphine cobalt +2 paramagnetic complex. We looked up a number of papers by Paul Chiric, okay, and they never report any P31 for their paramagnetic cobalt 2 phosphine complexes, and we didn't see it either, okay. So it was clear once you started digging into the supplementary material and comparing the analytical data that they didn't make our catalyst precursor. Okay. They're part of their response, okay, to our first letter, okay, which we kept fairly short. We included, you know, the IR and the NMR, and we thought that was sufficient to show that they didn't make our catalyst. They responded. And they said they couldn't get the same NMR spectra using published procedures. Okay, right? But then they don't admit that they didn't make the catalyst precursor. Okay, they complained multiple times. Okay, that we didn't assign all the peaks in our proton NMR spectrum. Well, they didn't assign any of the peaks in their proton NMR spectra. So I call that hypocrisy of the highest level. Okay. So, and they basically said we had to address this issue in our paper because basically we trust our ability to make this precursor more than we trust your ability to make this precursor. So, okay. So now we sent a second letter responding to their response, okay, and we included more information about studies we did, some of which were in the science paper. For example, here is a EPR of the catalyst precursor. Okay, actually, I have to check. I think this was in the supplementary material for the science paper. Okay, and it's beautiful. It completely supports a low spin cobalt +2 complex with the symmetrical chelating phosphines. And you know, everything just is beautiful here. Okay, and this was done by our EPR expert, Dr. David Vineyard, in LSU Biological Sciences. He worked a lot on helping us do this because I really don't know much about ESR. Okay, EPR. So, And we even had a crystal structure that Alex at ExxonMobil managed to get a crystal structure of the complex, and it's exactly what we think. We also had mass spec data and all this other kind of stuff, okay? When we looked at their paper more carefully, their ACAC cobalt dioxane precursor was proposed to be this, okay? That it's basically the cobalt ACAC dioxane precursor BF4 salt that you have to react with the bisphosphine, but their elemental analysis indicates 57 molecules of dioxane. What? Okay. And they show this structure where they have bridging dioxanes between the different cobalt centers. That also doesn't make any sense at all. First off, there aren't that many dioxane theoretically can bridge between two metal centers, but not when there's 57 molecules of dioxane in your unit cell somewhere, okay? And this should be a liquid, not a solid, okay? So this was absolutely crazy. And we could see the ACAC ligands and dioxane in our C13 NMR of our ACAC dioxane precursor. We did usually have some solvents of dioxane present, but typically like 2 to 4, which is sort of typical, okay? Not 57, okay? And that's pretty much the only thing they saw with the dioxane solvent in their NMR, C13 NMR. So that, I think this is the root problem of their inability to make our catalyst precursor, okay? Once again, we had the warning about the BF4, and you have to be careful with it. And you have, if it doesn't match our analytical data, then you have a problem, okay? So now, in one of their responses, in their second response, they say that we do show carbonyl bands that you could interpret as being hydridyl cobalt tetracarbonyl. They sort of fell back. They certainly proposed this in the response letters that they think it's our catalyst decomposing in some way to make hydridyl cobalt tetracarbonyl, which is the true catalyst, okay? This is information that was not in the science paper, okay? This is the activation of the catalyst precursor under hydrogen carbon monoxide pressure. This is an in situ infrared study. And what I want to, here's all the nice carbonyl peaks, okay? So, but I want to point out this band that grows in at around 1888 wave numbers, okay? We believe quite strongly that it's this type of cobalt dimer that forms, okay? And it has a tetrahedral cobalt center, which is paramagnetic, probably high spin, and that makes this a paramagnetic species. So we don't see any P31 NMR data for this type of complex. And based on DFT calculations, that supports this structure. And there's a fairly close contact between the cobalt, so we're drawing in a double bond here. I've looked at the molecular orbitals, and I can see where it looks like a sigma and a pi bond, which is consistent with what I've drawn here, okay? Well, when Alex Carpenter at ExxonMobil saw this, okay, this 1888 wave number band, he went crazy, okay? He said, hey, that's cobalt tetracarbonyl anion, and your catalyst may be falling apart to make hydridyl cobalt tetracarbonyl, and in the presence of any base, you can easily deprotonate it to make the cobalt tetracarbonyl anion, okay, which has a very strong pronounced peak at 1888 wave numbers. So we started doing a whole slew of experiments that are not in our science paper to show that it was not decomposition to hydridyl cobalt tetracarbonyl or cobalt tetracarbonyl anion. Okay. Now, the formation of the dimer is actually expected. Here's the hydridyl cobalt tetracarbonyl species. And this does dimerize with elimination of hydrogen to make the dicobalt octacarbonyl, which has a variety of isomeric forms. We think our system can do the same thing, and it forms this paramagnetic cobalt-1 dimer species that's dicationic, eliminating hydrogen. This is very reactive to hydrogen at higher temperatures, to fall apart and form the monometallic catalyst system, okay? But we also believe this can react with our catalyst precursor to form the dimer, which is why we start seeing it right as we're activating our catalyst in that previous NMR study. But as you keep it at around 120 degrees, the dimer falls apart under hydrogen pretty quickly. So Alex had just sort of mentioned, hey, maybe you want to look at some cobalt-59 NMR, which I'd never done. Okay, so but Drew got right on it. Okay, we have a great NMR facility at LSU. And he made the sodium cobalt tetracarbonyl. And all you need is, it's amazing, this cobalt-59 NMR. It's almost as easy to measure as protons, okay, for the sensitivity. So one pulse, he got this beautiful, sharp resonance. Now, when cobalt is a nuclear spin of 7 halves, and it normally they're quite broad resonances, but when it's high symmetry, you get these very sharp signals that you can pick out just like that. Okay, so he also threw in some paramagnetic cobalt chloride just to see the effect of paramagnetic compounds, and we could still easily see it with just a few pulses. Okay. We then generated our catalyst system in a high pressure NMR tube, ran the cobalt NMR, and there is nothing there, okay? We are not making hydridyl cobalt tetracarbonyl, which we could see in the cobalt-59. We are not making cobalt tetracarbonyl anion, which we would easily see in this thing. So there's some evidence. And then we did a number of experiments. For example, we added 1 equivalent of triambutyl to our catalyst system, and all it did was slow it down, okay? If we were making hydridyl cobalt tetracarbonyl, it would react with that to generate the Shell phosphine modified catalyst, which has 6-to-1 linear branch selectivity, not 1-to-1, okay? So we did study that. We also we've studied the Shell system multiple times, and it's very different. It's way slower. We see 6-to-1 linear branch selectivity. We're not doing that, okay? And then finally, we had the effect of more electron donating phosphines makes a much better catalyst system, okay? That goes against all hydroformylation with other metals, in that normally if you put on more electron donating phosphines, you get more pi back bonding to the carbonyls, and that slows the dissociation down, and you get much slower catalysis. Okay, so that's why almost everyone who's doing hydroformylation works with not alkylated phosphines. But we found that the electron donating phosphines makes a much better catalyst system. The reason for that is the way the heterolytic cleavage works and the ability to form that 19 electron carbonyl species that helps dissociate the equatorial carbonyl. That is favored by more strongly donating phosphines and the heterolytic cleavage of the hydrogen. So once again, I won't go over the catalytic cycle again, but we have everything points to the fact that the problem is completely on Frank and Zhang's end in making their catalyst precursor, our catalyst precursor, which they did not do, which is why they didn't see any of our results. Okay, so a couple obvious things here for the final thoughts here. They should have contacted us right away when they made our catalyst system and it didn't work. Okay, we would have happily sent them samples or given them advice or whatever. Okay, and they should have compared the analytical data to ours more carefully. And in fact, they admit that it did match, but they still somehow thought that they were making the good stuff and we weren't. Okay, and the reviewers certainly should have had more questions about their results and claiming that our catalyst system didn't work. If only even to go look at the supplemental material, it's pretty obvious from looking at the analytical data that they didn't make what we reported, okay? And I think the editors, if Julia's still around, okay, we'll maybe get some of her comments on this, okay? The editors should have contacted us prior to publication to get our feedback and input. Maybe not use us as reviewers, okay, but certainly say, hey, they're saying your catalyst doesn't work. What's the story? Did you make all this stuff up? And we could have, we would have sent them a sample. of our catalyst precursor, okay, that they could have tested. Okay, and we did follow, we did had all this data that we couldn't fit into the science paper, spectroscopic reaction studies, all that clearly indicate we were not making hydridyl cobalt tetracarbonyl or the phosphine modified shell type catalyst system, that it really was what we proposed or something very similar. Okay, and that's the Jack's paper right here that we published last year. Okay, and we did actually study the EPR of the actual catalyst system, and it turns out it's actually a high spin system, which is very unusual. Okay, the catalyst precursor was low spin. The catalyst appears is high spin based on our EPR studies, and that actually fits in with its high activity, and I can explain that if anyone's interested. So once again, I'll finish up with Alex Carpenter's final words of wisdom, that cobalt chemistry can be very tricky. And Frank and his collaborator are experts at rhodium chemistry, not cobalt chemistry. And I think they got burnt. So thank you very much. And thanking everybody who worked on this and all the funding from various companies that we've worked with.
Thank you, George. That's a great story. And it really highlights the importance of science being reproducible and being, and standing up to further study, which is important. And yeah, not everything gets by. Not all of the things get caught in review, right? So that was great. I'm just gonna say that I will be contacting you because these papers this story would be a great for an LO for teaching. So to have a story of like how how this could be used in teaching too, because that's what we love doing on IONiC. It's making teaching materials from current literature.
And I think there's also a lesson, and I was, if you look at the Jack's paper, okay, I like to think we took the high road, okay. We did put in the supplementary material comparisons between their spectroscopy and ours, that it clearly did match and everything. But what I'll say here is I think there was an arrogance on their side that they knew more than we did, okay? Because we're just some American schmoes at some third-rate university who really don't know what they're talking about, okay? But they should have known that ExxonMobil was our collaborator on this, okay? Now, Alex Carpenter isn't well known in the hydroformylation community, but he knows his stuff, okay? And he independently made and tested our catalyst system, okay?
Yeah. I knew Alex when he was a grad student because I was a postdoc in the lab next door. Great guy. Well,
so Julia, I have a question because Julia is an editor for a journal. Julia, what do you think the editor should have done?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, they should have contacted you. So why didn't they? I was curious.
That's the way science does things, okay?
Well, I have to say that one of the current challenges is that, reviewers and editors too were swamped.
Yep.
And so, there's so many papers and then, and I don't know, and a lot of, I mean, you could, did you, was it, okay, so I don't know what happened in the background, but, so did you have a chance to revise your manuscript based on reviewers' comments? Presumably, yes, right?
Oh yeah, the first science paper? Oh yeah, we had a fair number of reviewer comments that we had to address and incorporate. As usual, there was some that wanted like some extra work that it would have been really difficult because I was already here in Colorado and didn't have a research group anymore. So that would have been really difficult for us to go back, but I theoretically we could have gotten Matt Chambers and some of his students involved, but we were able to argue around it, okay? So yeah, we did a fair number of revisions, okay?
Well, the editor,
pretty minor, okay, so.
Well, the editor accepted your paper.
Yeah.
So it's good.
Yeah.
I mean, you all did the right thing by reproducing. I think that's the take-home message. I think that's okay.
Yeah. I mean,
well, I think anytime you have this cobalt result is amazing. Okay, one of the PR pieces when we published our science paper back in 2020 was this is the biggest advance in hydroformylation in the last 50 years. That is not an exaggeration. Okay, and in hindsight, this cationic effect. Okay, we think it can be applied to other metals. Okay, I've done some calculations and indicate some of the iron analogs could be even more reactive than the cobalt system. Okay, man, a highly active iron catalyst. Wow. Okay, so Matt gets to work on that one. Okay, so
Cool. How fun.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean I love that it's simple diphosphine ligands like DPP-BZ is air stable and it's just like you can buy in a bottle, right? It's a nice thing to work with.
But the electron rich ones work better.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, they do. Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
So,
But you could yeah, and I worked with that phosphine on platinum in grad school. Yeah.
yeah, one of the things we were really, here's my sort of hand waving explanation, because I mentioned early on that all rhodium or cobalt phosphine complexes have a phosphine dissociation equilibrium associated with them, even with the chelating phosphines. Okay, and if you slap one of these super chelating phosphines on a rhodium, it doesn't do hardly anything. Okay, but we think we're not getting any real dissociative equilibrium of the phosphine, despite this 19 electron thing. And one of the reasons is the carbonyls are not good ligands. You got carbonyls, hydrogen, and alkenes. None of them are particularly good ligands for the cobalt. Okay, the best ligand is the phosphine, and it just can't stand losing. It's a thermodynamic. It's really bad thermodynamically if it wants to dissociate that phosphine ligand. But for all the other cobalt and rhodium catalysts, they're more electron rich. They can lose their phosphine ligands. And carbonyl has a much higher tendency to want to coordinate and compensate for the loss of the phosphine ligand because they're more electron rich complexes. Yep. Our system isn't.
Yep.
Okay? And that's why it loves the electron rich phosphine. Okay, for a variety of reasons. Okay, and I think because in the science paper we talk about we did a 2-week run where we did 1.2 million turnovers, and it was still running. Yep. Okay, and it didn't show any sign of decomposition. Okay, it was like wow. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, being able to run a catalyst for a long time and then have it, or even reusing it in cycles, or looking at it in situ after running it for a long time, right? And then seeing, yep, there's something still there. Shirley, do you have your hand raised?
I do. So I have a couple of questions / comments. One is, have you heard from Drs. Frank and Zhang since your JAX paper?
Nope. No. The third letter I wrote, okay, I can pull up the letters if you guys want to see them, okay? The third letter I wrote, we went over a lot of this stuff again, okay? And then finally, I said at the end of the letter, you're just not going to believe anything we say.
Yeah.
Okay, referring to Frank and Zhang, okay? It was mostly Frank. Frank was the one who always responded to the letters through the editor. And I said, we're just going to go ahead and publish all this stuff, okay? And, for the JAX paper, the reviewers were right with us. Yep. Okay. We had to do minor revisions as always. Okay. Yep. But it was like, yeah, we can see where you're coming from. Okay. So we convinced the reviewers on the JAX paper. Otherwise, it wouldn't have gotten into JAX. Yep. Okay. So,
yeah. And I think before Shirley ask more, but again, this goes back to having all your raw data, show the spectra, show the characterization, and it's got to match, right? Got to make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, you got to rethink it, right?
Yeah.
Shirley.
Yeah. The other thing that really struck me is when you were talking about the BF4 etherate acid, right? And your cautionary tale about, the different batches matter. And I'm just thinking back to, my graduate school days. I did metallocene catalyzed olefin polymerization, and we used methylaluminoxane as our activator, and the batches of that are different. and you have to be careful, and you have to cite where you bought it, and you know what batch number and things like that. And then I've encountered that over and over again in different contexts. I mean, it's not every reagent, but I'm just wondering, is there a time that is there a time that we can have this discussion about how do we make those more consistent? You know, these different reagents and batches of reagents. And how do we have better characterization so we can actually understand what's going on? And I know
Yeah.
MAO has been studied a lot, so MAO is not the best example, but I'm wondering what's going on, you know, in this case with the BF4 etherate acid. You know, what are these different batches? Why is one lighter and one is darker? You know.
Well, the great thing about BF4 is you've got the boron and the fluorine nucleus. You could do those two NMRs on each of your batches, right? And just do lots of scans and look for little blips, like what are the impurities, right?
But we actually never did that. Okay. Either, in fact, when we got this batch, usually I wasn't the one in the lab doing it, but they showed me the BF4 etherate was usually this ugly brown color. Okay. And then we got this batch of this tan stuff. I said, ooh, I bet that's good stuff. No. They said, oh no, it screwed things up. But it's a real pain working with paramagnetic complexes. I really admire Klaus Theopold, okay, for his years of working on paramagnetic systems, okay, because look, not having P31 NMR, it was painful, okay.
Yeah. So in the interest of time,
sure.
Yep, are there any other last thoughts or things?
Not really. Once again, the lesson here is, I think if you are trying to reproduce someone's results and it's not working, just contact them.
Yep, reach out.
That's the first thing to do. I mean, you do it a couple times, make sure your student's not screwing up, okay? But then contact the author of the paper you're trying to reproduce results from. And in fact, Ian Tonks contacted me because they were trying to make the precursor. He had an undergraduate working on it, and she was having some problems. And we gave him some advice. I put him in contact with Matt Chambers, okay, because Matt's been improving the synthesis, okay, of the precursor. Okay? And as far as I know, it cleared everything up.
Great.
Okay?
Yeah, communication is key.
Yeah.
So I threw a little short survey for the attendees, just saying, for everyone. And thanks again to George for this great presentation and discussion. And we're looking forward to our future SLiTHERs. We're gonna have all sorts of things relating to research, teaching, and other parts of life of being a chemist and an academic. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.